In this video, I'll talk about my first ride on the newly redesigned Transition Sentinel. And this video will actually cover the first two rides because I had to take a while to get the suspension set up. So normally what I do is I will ride the bike locally before I do a trip with the bike and get the suspension really tuned, get the levers set, everything perfect. But I was headed up on a trip up to North Georgia, and I decided at the last minute I was going to bring this bike because I was going to bring my Niner 27.5 and Niner Jet 9, and I decided to bring the RIP 27.5 and this bike because I could not wait to get this bike out on the trails. And I'm glad I did because I've been having a blast on this bike. So we drove straight up to a trail system called Bull Mountain and Jake Mountain. And in the parking lot, I set up the sag because I put my hydration pack on and I wanted to get the sag set up with the hydration pack fully set up in my gear. And I don't know if the parking lot was just not perfectly level, but I ended up with too much pressure in the shock. And I did a 4-hour ride with the shock pressure a little bit too high. In fact, I had 160 PSI in the shock, and when I got back to the cabin that night, I set the sag again on the perfectly level deck and ended up with 140. So I had 20 PSI too high in the shock. However, I still had a blast riding the bike. First of all, riding Bull Mountain, Jake Mountain, nothing there really pushed the Sentinel to its limits. It wasn't steep or technical enough to really cause this bike to, like I said, get at the limits, but it still did great. Now, the second day we rode up at Tanasi or Ocoee Whitewater Center, and there's a trail there called Thunder Rock Express, which kind of is more what this bike is designed for. Steep, little technical, not too bad, nothing like what we ride in Pisgah. But let me just talk about the characteristics of this bike and what I've noticed again the first 2 days of riding. First, I'll talk about climbing on this bike, since that's usually what you have to do before you can enjoy the downhill. So this bike weighed in, I think it was around 32 pounds with the pedals and water bottle cage. You can go back and watch my first look video for the exact weight. And this bike is, the best way to describe it is just a steady climber. You want to stay in the saddle on this bike because the front fork does not have a lockout. I did use the rear lockout. It's not really a lockout, it just firms up the shock. So I use that only on fire road climbs and double track climbs. If the climb was rooty and rocky, which we had a lot of up here, then I would leave the rear shock in the less firm setting, or I call it the open setting. And this bike has phenomenal traction when climbing. I mean, it's a 29er, it's got 150 mil travel in the rear, and the suspension, the Fox X2 shock is just amazing. And that allowed the tire to really conform over the roots and the rocks. Another thing about this bike is I've had 0 pedal strikes, which I love, because when you're climbing up a rooty, rocky section, you know, bikes that have pedal strikes, you're just almost cringing when you're about to hit a root or a rock. But on this bike, I have no pedal strikes. I mean, it's a testament to the 170 crank arms that Transition chose to spec on this bike, but also, you know, being a 29er just sits up a little bit higher. But the bottom bracket is still fairly low to give it that kind of a little bit lower center of gravity when you're descending, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Another thing that I want to mention about the climbing is, even though the head angle is slack, less than 64 degrees on a 29er, the front end did not wander around that much because the seat tube angle is fairly steep. Also, the short stem and wide bars kind of just make the bike a little bit more manageable on the climbs. You know, you do have to lean forward when it gets really steep, like, you know, 20% grade. And, you know, you have to get your weight forward to manage the front end, but it's not too bad. Nothing like you would think for a 29er with a head angle this slack. So climbing, I guess the best way to describe it is just steady. I mean, it's not going to climb like a cross-country bike. Anybody who says an enduro bike climbs like a cross-country bike is either lying to you or they've never ridden a cross-country bike up a hill. But, you know, enduro bikes are designed to get you up the hill without a lot of, you know, extreme effort. And just steady. I mean, that's just the best way to describe this bike. You stay in the saddle, you crank, it'll get you up the climbs, no problem. Now let's talk about descending on the bike, because this is why you buy an enduro bike and why I ride an enduro bike up here. Descending on this bike, the best way to describe it is just fast, smooth, and planted. Now, I will say I had to get the brakes seated in because I hadn't even had time to seat in the brakes. So normally, you know, what you do is you do about 10 hard stops, almost to a full stop, to really get the pad seated in. I didn't have a chance to do that before I grabbed this bike and headed up here. So the first couple descents I had to really seat in the brakes. I almost overshot a corner because the brakes didn't grab like I thought they were going to. But once I seated in the brakes, they're phenomenal. Like the 4-piston brakes that just have a ton of power without giving up modulation. So the brakes for descending are great. I will say that shifting has been flawless the first 2 days of riding this bike. So I've got about only 6 hours on the bike so far, but the shifting has just been absolutely flawless. All right, now let's talk about how this bike really does on the descent. So the stability that you get out of this bike on the descents is like no other bike that I've ridden. I mean, it's a 29er with slack angles, so you're going to have a bike that's stable. That's why I ride a 29er. I want to go fast and I want to feel in control, and that's the way you do on this bike. I mean, I would come around corners, and there was one section of the Thunder Rock Express Trail that we rode that you come around a corner and you hit a root, and a root garden, I should say. The bike just, no fuss. I mean, just, it's a blind corner because it's overgrown a little bit in some sections, but you just come around the corner and I hit that thing, and it was just like, wow, that was no big deal. So the suspension is what really helps this bike. So the Fox X2 shock, even though the X2 shock takes a lot of tuning, and the other thing that I did when I got the bike back to the cabin that first night is I really kind of asked myself what I wanted out of the suspension, because you can adjust high and low speed rebound and high and low speed compression both on the shock and the fork. And so I really wanted to just think about what I wanted out of the shock. So I run very little compression damping, but a little bit more rebound damping, because the first day I felt like the tires were skipping around a lot. It's going to take a lot of rides to get this suspension tuned. Fox sells this little tool that's got like a 6mm Allen wrench on one and 3 on the other. It's a little like this big that I ordered. Because I want to have that in my pocket when I'm riding. Rebound is a little bit easier to set up than compression. Compression is one of those things where you really want to get out and ride, make little tweaks. So I'll be doing that for a while, but I would say after I spent that first night really dialing in the sag, dialing in the compression and rebound like I felt like I wanted, the suspension was absolutely phenomenal. I mentioned the short stem and wide bars on the climbs. I also appreciate it on the descents because it makes the bike feel more lively. So again, even though it's slack angles, when you're going around some tighter stuff, maybe switchbacks, having that short stem just helps the bike feel a little bit more lively. Another thing that I really appreciated about this bike is the long dropper post. I think I said it's 180 in the first video, but that allows that seat post to get way down, because what I did was I found myself really squatting down and getting my center of gravity low on some tight, fast corners, which you have to do more on a 29er. So having the seat post that can really drop out of the way is really important. Another thing that I want to mention about the descending on this bike is it is so quiet. There is no cable rattling, there is no chain slap noise, totally silent. So again, smooth, fast, planted, quiet. That's the best way to describe how this bike descends. Maintenance-wise, the bike's been totally fine except for one small issue, and that is the front brake pads started rubbing after the first ride. I centered them that night, and then at the end of the second ride, they started doing the same thing. So I must have to tighten the Allen bolts a little bit tighter, so I'll have to do that again for this ride coming up today. But other than that, the bike's been totally fine. I'm inserting a quick update here on the dragging brake pad. It ended up being a stuck piston, so I didn't have a bleed block with me. It's 4-piston brakes, so I needed something to keep those other 2 pistons from moving. So we had to run to Car Decay Bike Shop, get a bleed block, and then solve that issue. Once I did that, the piston unstuck and it was good to go. And I do want to mention that the saddle that comes on this bike is great. It's probably one of the first house brand saddles that I will not change out. I mean, the first ride was like 4 hours and I was totally comfortable in this saddle. So conclusion after the first 2 days, this is a bike that feels more lively than the numbers make it look. In fact, I would definitely say it's more poppy and playful than the original Sentinel. I love the original Sentinel and it's a great bike, but this one just feels a little bit more progressive. The rear suspension on this feels absolutely bottomless. I don't think I've bottomed out the suspension yet since we've been riding. So yeah, that'll wrap up my first 2 days of riding the Transition Sentinel. Again, I always try to do a first ride video, so this is it. And I'll follow up this video with some more a few months down the road after I get more hours and miles on this bike. Any questions or comments so far, drop those below. Thanks for watching.